Welcome everyone to Awesome Truth, a wrestling book club. I'm your host, Steve Semino, and with me as always is my co-host, Walt Schwenk. Hey, Walters.
Hello, Steven. How's it going?
My friends, it is going very well. We are back on Awesome Truth. And we are dipping back into the comic book world, Walt. Today we've actually talked about a surprising number of comic books. I didn't think when we got into doing this podcast that we would cover 6 to 7 to more comic books about pro wrestling. But here we are, and we're covering something that we talked about before on the show. If you're a regular listener, you know that a few months ago we talked to Dirk Manning and Tony Schiavone about Tony Schiavone's comic book, the story of his life in comic book form. And here we are today, Walt, talking about, I have it in my hands right now, Butts and Seats, the Tony Schiavone story.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, from a content perspective, it's great to always, if you're going to read a book, it's great to interview the people who did it, A, and B, really maximize your programming slate just to be able to talk about before and after. But
yes.
Sorry,
that's a calculated move on our part. As much as we enjoy Dirk and Tony,
yeah,
2 for the price of 1.
But yeah, but it was nice to hear about the process that led to it and what with it, like how this whole thing started, because to your point, when you think of wrestling book club, you don't think of wrestling comic books or graphic novels. So hearing about that it was really great to get in their heads ahead of reading this, because if this came out just on the shelves without any sort of context, like, I don't know how I would have felt about it, but I was understandably genuinely excited because we had this great conversation with those two, and just hearing about Tony talk about his career and the way he does often, but especially to us.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, this comes we're still in the middle. It seems like it might have tailed off by now, but I don't think it has at all, of the Tony Schiavone Goodwill Tour. Like for the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years now, maybe, it's been just a love fest for Tony. Since he started the podcast with Conrad, he's just been wormed his way back into the hearts of wrestling fans. Those who liked him before when he was with WCW, and those who sort of thought he was a dweeb, and maybe just didn't resonate with him when he was a grown man talking about wrestling in front of us. I personally didn't find him very cool when I was 12 years old, but now as a grown man myself, I think he's cool as hell. And this book is really sort of, I don't think it doesn't even serve as sort of an encapsulation necessarily of capitalizing on that goodwill. It just really is like, I think this could have come out at any time in the last little while. I don't think it's necessarily tied to us all loving him. It's just, here's my story. It's almost like Tony and Dirk and everyone involved wanted to tell Tony's story, and Tony probably didn't want to write a 400, not to put words in his mouth, but didn't want to produce a massive tome, didn't want to sit down and just peck away for months and months, years even. And so they had the great idea of just, why not visually represent half the story and sort of condense it. And I think from our perspective, we give that a big yay, just in terms of size of literature. I'm holding the book in my hands and I'm like, oh, it's only 100 pages. This is great. I can get through this in 2 days.
Yeah, I mean, this book really serves less like this piece of history and literature that people are going to read to get a better understanding of wrestling. This is just a monument to this guy's life and his and a testament to his great comeback story into wrestling. Because the number one question I have been asking myself, because to your point, I never really thought he during the height of WCW, he was the voice of WCW, but you never really thought of him the same way you thought of JR. You know what I mean? In ways that I'm not going to necessarily articulate, but but obviously with what we've learned about this guy in the last few years with the podcast, it's you always wonder whatever happened to this guy before he started the podcast. It's what happened to him? How, just because he's not JR in the 90s doesn't mean he doesn't have a place in wrestling. Mm-hmm. And he had those short stints in TNA and or short stint. It was a day.
That is the shortest possible stint, pretty much.
And like there was always that big like, where the hell did this guy go for so long? And you know, reading about it, like that was the number one question I had over the last 20, 30 years, and that was certainly answered with this, and in a way that lends itself to the author and to the person himself. Like with these mundane details of like his time outside of wrestling have been interesting on the written word. Like maybe not. Like I would hope so. I would think so. But like reading it in a comic book form made it just a better experience for the reader, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, because it does, it doesn't harp on anything too much. Like, I'd say this book
Right.
has sort of the Tony Schiavone tone the whole time of sort of like an unassuming, bystander. Not a bystander, that's a little too harsh of a term, because he certainly gets involved, but he doesn't seem egotistical at all. He's not over the top. He's never too much. Like, he doesn't slide into the background, but he shows up and he does his job, And I think the way this book is told is very much like that. Like, maybe it doesn't get as bombastic as maybe you'd like a wrestling comic book to be. It's a little quieter, a little chiller. But I think when it does get to the part you're talking about, like what did Tony do when WCW went away, it just shows him. It's like it's like I busted my ass working part-time odd jobs for 15 years, and you're like, and it's pictures of Tony at like a Starbucks hat, and he's not ashamed of that, and nor should he be. But it's just, I just appreciate how real that is. They did not try and clean it up. They didn't try and make it seem big. They didn't even try and make it sad, They didn't try and make you feel awful for Tony. They just sort of said, this is what I did. Like, this is how I had to make it. And, like, I think that is just very Tony. Like, talking to him on the show, listening to his podcast with Conrad Thompson, just knowing what I know about his life now, I'm like, that is a very good encapsulation of who this guy is. Like, he's just a strong, foundational, infrastructure-y kind of dude, Like, he's a bedrock. He holds things together, and I think this book is very, very true to that.
Yeah, and having listened to the podcast and kind of
and you're a bigger podcast fan than I am, I should say. I'm a dabbler, but you were really into it for a while, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was my number one gym, like, podcasts during long workouts content, like, and it was great for that because during the height of the show, you could kind of like, when he was saying something funny or interesting about himself, like, you're listening, and then because there's mostly watch alongs. I was at the gym, I wasn't watching along. It was easy to kind of tune out. But I think ultimately to say is, for the most part, none of this was new information, because having listened to the podcast, I guess I really do know the story. But that's not a criticism. That's just like, I know what Klondike Bill looks like now, which was like fun and ridiculous.
That was fun.
But he's told, like, he's told his best stories on the podcast after 200 episodes, and like now we're seeing it in comic book form, so, which is like fun. But I just have to like sit back and say, like, yeah, not that I was expecting to get new and different stories, but like I gotta know the greatest hits at this point, which is fun.
Yeah, it's interesting, sort of dynamic you're describing, though, because I imagine they're pretty close to concentric circles, listeners to What Happened When, and people who buy this comic book. So
Right.
there obviously is enough for him to make a living for quite a while there before he went back to AEW. So I know there's a strong listenership for What Happened When, and I imagine they all bought his book, and they all probably responded the way you did, which is like, oh, I sort of already know this, but like, no harm, no foul. Like, we love Tony, we love his stories, happy to spend $25 to support him and his stories. And this is, like I said, this is just, his story is not tailor-made for graphic novel, for comic book. Like, there's not a ton of panels that really jumped out at me, to be honest. Like, it's not visually striking, I would say, which is fine. It's not the comic book story of pro wrestling. Like, Aubrey and Chris, who we've had on the show, set out to make like that's like as close to a superhero book about real life pro wrestling as you can, and it's just colorful and wild, and they went all out there. This is, again, hewing to a more realistic style, which is fine, but it just there's not a ton. I did not mark up a ton of panels to like go back and look at someday. I wasn't like, whoa, what a unique look. Like, the funniest thing visually is the way every chapter is drawn by somebody else. And so the fun thing about that is you get different versions of Tony constantly. And it was enjoyable for me to look through chapters and be like, this one doesn't look like Tony at all. Like this one is like a very hunky Tony, or like this one's a frumpy Tony. Like it was nice to flip through it and see how. And I feel like part of that was done in very enjoyable jests, but that was the part that I thought was the most visually enjoyable, is just how everybody decided to interpret their part of the Tony story.
Yeah, no, I mean that's definitely a big discernible difference between butts and seats and the comic book story of pro wrestling. I just think though that, and this is the perspective of someone who's worked for a publishing company that makes comic books, but I mean having consistency with art, it can, especially when you have like artist work, that comic book story of pro wrestling. I'm gonna butcher that, but whatever Chris and Aubrey did, they had a mastery of artwork and the understanding of this. And you know, I have my favorite iterations of Tony on the page. I'm not saying any of them are bad, but I think the consistency, if you have good consistency, could actually elevate the artwork throughout it. But I also know this was a GoFundMe or Kickstarter, and Dirk has a lot of connections in this area, and maybe it was a situation where you needed multiple artists, so just for budgetary reasons. So I get it, and I'm not saying like the artwork was bad. I'm just saying the consistency can be a factor when you're reading something like this, and ultimately, though, everybody who did draw Tony did a pretty fun job.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a passion project for everybody and like a fun little romp, and why not do 12 pages, like who knows logistical reasons. But like I said, it definitely stands out. Like it, for better or worse, that's up to your interpretation, but it made it added an interest to the visual elements that I didn't necessarily expect going into it. But like they, again, one of the things that I think they do really well is take the mundane and give it some life. Like I really enjoyed it. The actual best panel I think that I remember is later in the book when Tony's going through some hard times and they're talking about, what jobs he's going to take, how is he going to pay the bills, et cetera, et cetera. There's one panel of him holding up, a bunch of papers that say tuition on them. Like, literally, just like, these are papers about his tuition. And then someone is also holding a sack of money in his face. And he looks very forlorn and fraught and isn't sure what to do. And, I like that. That's it's a very dumb, silly one, but I like that. It's funny. That's probably really boils down to probably what it felt like. I have no idea where to turn. Should I take this? I'm sure there were cash grabs being offered to him all the time, wrestling related. Obviously, he did a couple of them and they made him sad. I think it was a very good way to illustrate the emotions of this guy who was going through something and make it seem more enjoyable and less depressing.
Yeah, he goes into the idea of he had to quit certain broadcasting jobs because it just didn't pay enough, and it's you're the voice of the Georgia Bulldogs football team, and you're telling me you're poor. Mm-hmm. Or in certain other iterations, he was the voice of wrestling for a majority of the 90s, and he's I can't afford to live in Connecticut, or I can't, that wrestling money, yeah, I will take the severance, but at some point I'm gonna have to work again, and I have 5 kids and I have to pay for college, and so it's so you do kind of get those that reality of the fact that financially it wasn't just oh, it was on TV and I always have some level of income. It's he really struggled and gave us more insight into what that meant for him and his family than I anticipated, especially when the panel is comically drawn where it's tuition and to your point, and there's the money bag. It's there are times where I was oh man, that's sad when he's asking his kids to help pay the mortgage. I'm that's probably not a conversation any of us ever want to have with our theoretical kids.
And
Like,
very honest too. He doesn't need to go into that. I imagine most people are going to open this up and expect a series of wrestling stories. Like I imagine they'll expect like that Jim Cornette comic book we read a while ago, which was terrible and very
that
very
soulless
bad.
money grab. Yeah.
Yeah, and was just basically like Jim Cornette, a series of short stories by Jim Cornette about wrestling, and it's just shit he's heard or seen or whatever, and it was just monotonous, whatever. Like that is just soulless is a good word for it, cheap, lazy, like just really nothing there. Like just Jim Cornette slapping his name on it and some artists farting it out, and it being one of the more forgettable things we covered, which is a lot because we've done 120 episodes, and if we hate something that much, it's bad. But this does not do that at all. This is not, at the end they have some wrestling stories, and they're funny because they're so inconsequential. Like you get to the end and there's a panel of Tony being like, "I know you guys want some wrestling stories, don't you? Here you go." And then the stories are like, "The Road Warriors cut me with their spiky pads. Barry Windham made me poop. And the Four Horsemen left me at a bar." Like, those are literally his stories. And I was like, that is like, I feel like that's a calculated move on his part too. Like, you guys want these stories? I'm sure there are worse ones he could tell and more wild ones, but I like that he picked these like super 2-page, like real straightforward, sort of nerdy stories. Sort of again, like he's like the man on the sidelines. Like he's there, he's around, he gets to hang out with Flair all night. Like that's pretty cool. But at the end of the day, Flair leaves him at the bar and rides away in his limo. Like it's just There's stories that encapsulate sort of the Tony sense of humor, Tony's place in the business, Tony's friends with everybody, but he's not like intimately involved. Like I feel like they were very unique choices that made me laugh for their own reasons.
Yeah, and I appreciate the idea of like, hey, here, thank you for reading about my life story and my struggles and my triumphs in the wrestling business. Here's just a hodgepodge of additional content. It's like, I appreciate you not forcing that into the narrative of your life like a book would. I mean, like we've read countless wrestling books where it's like, oh, by the way, one night I did this thing and there was with a bunch of wrestlers in a hotel room, and then that was it. Like there's actually connect to the time I won the world title or around that time when I was on the path to winning the world title. But you're going to hear this story because I just want to get my shit in. It's like, at least he kind of separated like getting the shit in with like the actual reason why we're here, which is to learn about his story. So, I appreciate that, if nothing else.
Yeah, and there's this panel near the end where he even gets a little philosophical. This page near the end, a series of panels where he's talking about Klondike Bill, and it's Tony in front of with a Batman poster, and he's got a little dog on his lap, and he's looking, a little cartoony but a little contemplative, and he talks about his philosophies on wrestling. Like he talks about how he values wrestling as an outlet for the people involved in it. Like they're they're colorful, they're weird, they're crazy, and he intimates and I guess he comes out and says that he's not sure what would happen if they didn't have wrestling, And to me, that was, the way they have to include that in this book, the way they just sort of mention it offhand near the end, it's a point that like I've heard other people say and I get where they're coming from, but for some reason reading it in this book I was like, you know what, I see where they're coming from. Like we talk a lot in the show, wrestling journalists, most wrestling fans of this era, we talk about all the death, all the destruction, all the mayhem, all the drunken escapades, all the crimes that people have committed tied to the wrestling industry for decades now. It has killed people, it has exploited people, it has ruined their lives, but we always hear them also say, and I would do it all over again. I love being a part of this, the camaraderie, all that. And I'm always like, what are you guys like? You guys are all like not brainwashed, but like, come on, take a step back. But hearing Tony say it, I'm like, you know what? Like, I get it. Like some of these people probably didn't have anywhere else to go, like this, or this is just what they wanted to do so much that they couldn't imagine being anywhere else. And hearing Tony say that with his sort of eagle-eye view of so much of this, like over the decades, watching down on people, hanging out with them, helping them out, giving them tidbits, producing, talking, like he's always had an advantage point to wrestling that very few other people can claim to have. And so when he makes that observation and says sort of like implies like for all the bad there is a lot of good, and I'm sure he sees both sides. Like I don't know, it just meant a lot to me in a way that other people saying it really didn't before.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it helps that like Tony is a guy, and like he like not to discredit like the talent he has as an announcer and his ability to kind of make wrestling feel more sport in his announcing. And this is me making up for the fact that I had said he was no JR in the 90s.
Well, I called him a dweeb. So.
Fair. Well,
if he's listening, he's going to call us some real slap nuts. So.
Yeah, well, he already did to our face. But all that is the reason I bring that up is because ultimately Tony is a guy. He's not a wrestler. He's not crazy. He's not like this tortured artist. He's a guy trying to provide for his family and Lois, and trying to make ends meet. And like every decision was just for the sake of his family and like making the most money. But also, and like, cause like he even retold the story about how he like supported Eric Bischoff when he was going for president. And it's like, you didn't have to tell that part of the story. Like there wasn't even like a reason for that being there other than you're like, oh, then Eric took over. And that was really great because Eric is a good guy. We're close friends. It's like the end. Like, wow. Yeah. That there seems to be no pettiness or jealousy there. Like, like I don't,
Yeah, he doesn't burn bridges. He doesn't bring up old grudges. He doesn't open old wounds. Like, he doesn't do any of that. Like, if he was frustrated at most of these people at some point, doesn't really get into it at all, which is also super not wrestling. Many of the books we've read, especially like you said, hinted at, sort of the talents love to get their shit in. They love to take their pot shots. Many of them are holding grudges for 30 years now against various slights they've been through. Tony is not that kind of person at all, and it's refreshing.
Yeah, it is, and it just makes you like. I don't think this is a novel thought, but like it just makes you root for him. You know where the story goes. We all know that he's back on in wrestling, and that's great. And even as you're reliving all this with him, you root for him even more because he's just so grounded. It's like you want like, and even when he's like at his lowest, it's still like, well, you know what? I worked at Starbucks, and that's fine. Like that's totally normal thing that people do when they need work. It's like, yeah, you're right.
Yep.
Yeah, so ultimately, though, I just think that his perspective is different, and it's because he's not a crazy wrestler.
Yeah, and like there's a coolness about him. Very little that he does is actually cool, and I mean that in a loving way. He also just doesn't seem like he cares what anybody thinks, Like
right.
He married the love of his life. He had 5 kids. He did what he had to do to make ends meet. Like he just does. He seems like he is not trying to impress anyone. He is not never showing off. Like he does what he wants to do because he wants to do it. And if he has to grind, he's gonna grind. If he has an opportunity to make more money, he's gonna take it. If he's gonna follow his passion, sometimes he'll do that too. Like I just like that. Like it's not that he's like complacent or anything. You don't get that sense at all. But you just get the vibe in reading this and listening to him talk that like he puts himself in the right places, and he mentions that in the book. He tries to succeed, obviously, but he doesn't, suck up to anybody. He doesn't seem to go over and above the call of duty when he doesn't have to. Like he's just steady and competent and like a rock. And I think that is great. Like and I personally really value somebody who just shows up and does their thing and doesn't worry so much about the consequences. And that's probably not the way to get ahead in a cutthroat, shitty business like wrestling, but which might be why he was floating around as a free agent for 2 decades. But now that he's found his foothold and he's doing great, it just makes me, it makes his story that much better, and it makes him that much more genuine.
Right, and he's like we said, he's grounded, and he's certainly a family man. And I think that some of the most interesting parts of this book were the origin stories of him and Lois, which is like kind of funny to say, but like kind of true. Just the controversy of him and Lois dating, and like then they fired Lois from the radio station, and I think I might have misread this, but I believe that they got like he proposes to her like within like 2 months of meeting her or something like that.
No, yeah, it's super fast. That's right.
Which I also thought was interesting, and then everybody was threatened to be fired if they went to their wedding. It's like that was like more information than I ever knew about like him and his wife, and so I found that arguably some of the most interesting content of this.
Yeah, and again, that's not typical comic book fodder necessarily, but I get it's understated. He doesn't make it all melodramatic. He just sort of lists what happened, and it is one of those things you're flipping, you're like, wait, did I read that right? Like that was just a throwaway line in like the third panel on this page that all this stuff happens. But I presume that's how he wanted it. Like it seems to be his sort of style. So it's different, and I think in a good way, and like I think that's Tony's whole thing. And like we said at the top, like he's just what he's done now and where he is. Just he's one of those guys when I see him on AEW, like I'm so happy to see him there. You know, I'm just like knowing what you've been through and knowing the kind of guy you are. Like I'm so pumped that you found a place in this business again, and at a company that seems to actually treat them nice and well, and he's taking his victory lap, and he's supporting his family, and he's getting the respect he deserves. Like it's all just like such a success story.
Yeah, and that was another thing I was going to bring up with regards to my most interesting parts of the book is the end when he talks about like landing at AEW after starting the podcast. Apparently Vince wanted him back. I didn't know that.
That's such a goddamn WWE thing to do, you know? Like it seems like Vince was stringing him along to screw him over just as much as he was trying to get him back.
But was that known before? Like I feel like maybe it was, but like I don't remember Vince and then Bruce Pritchard like reaching out to him and asking for him to come back in any capacity. I remember him saying he reached out a bunch and asked for like a job when WCW fell through and he couldn't get a call back. But like, I didn't know that around the time of AEW they were like trying to bring him back.
It just reeked to me of and again Tony has every opportunity there to say, you know, Vince and these people, this company sucks, you know, they jerked me around, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't do it at all. He just outlines in an almost bullet pointy fashion, this is how it happened. Like, I made this call, and then I made that call, and then Tony called me, and then Vince called me, and then I went to meet Tony. Like, he just sort of explains the events, and that's huge because I was in reading it, I even wrote my notes to you. I'm like, fucking WWE, just, you know, always toying with people, always dangling the carrot. Like, it just fits the same type of story you've heard a bunch of times before. But Tony's not one to you know, even in a moment of frustration, he's not one to piss them off or burn any bridges. Like, it's noble. Like, I don't think I'd have at the very least, you can take a pot shot at the company. Like, they're $1 billion behemoth. They don't really. You can call them. You can critique their hiring processes or their calling you back processes. But for the most part, he turns the other cheek.
Or at least criticize Bruce Pritchard for
which is also ripe for criticism.
But I feel like Cody in 2022 fans kind of really shit on in some ways, but that story is really that Tony tells about Cody texting like, give me a call right now, I'll put you in touch with Tony immediately. It's like, that's kind of endearing. It's like, thanks Cody for being a really good dude.
And now that Tony's been doing it for a couple of years again, it seems so obvious. Like, of course they'd hire Tony Schiavone, but to the casual wrestling fan who didn't know the Conrad podcast or anything, like 3 years ago, Tony was that guy who wore denim shirts and like weird leather vests on WCW, you know, like He was not cool. He was not interesting. He was not really a thought in anybody's mind. So the fact that AEW hired him was not, fait accompli. Like, it was not the plan, I'm sure. But now he's just so good at it, and he's aged into himself so well too, that it just seems like a no-brainer. But as you said, it was like a pretty cool move to go that route, and also like with the concern of like you're just gonna seem like WCW 2.0. You know, if you bring in Tony, they're like, oh, Tony's here. Like, oh, it's the same thing. Like, it's the same shitty second tier company that lost to WWE. But no one looks at it at all at this point. Like, it's just a good hire. He's just good at his job.
Yeah, right. It's so weird.
Yeah.
Why does WWE see
just
that?
hire a competent man to do a very excellent job. Like, what a novel concept.
Yeah, but I mean, he does talk about how he started dabbling his toe back into wrestling announcing with MLW But that being said, if AEW doesn't come calling and giving him what I would assume is a more lucrative contract than whatever MLW could afford to pay him, like he might not be back into wrestling again. He might just be doing the podcast, and if you pay X amount of dollars on Patreon, you'll get to see him on a live stream calling a slapdick. But that's all we're getting. But like the fact of the matter is, like AEW was a legitimate offer, I would assume, and to the point that he's not just doing a one shot here or a two shot there. It's like he's in the company. He's doing all the stuff. Like he's there in a week. He's as much of a character on that show than Kenny Omega these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that sums him up so well. Like, obviously, he likes wrestling a lot, loves wrestling at times, and seems genuinely enthused to be back in it. But at the same time, as you noted, I don't think he would have taken it just for the love of the game. You know, he's not one of those types. He's not someone who would give up his livelihood and his family to chase a dream or even the idea of a dream at this point, which I respect a ton. Like that's how the best people in wrestling, it's unfortunate because passion is obviously a huge way to get into this business, but the people who get out of wrestling functional and happy are the ones who treat it like a job, Like, you can love your job, you can show up every day and give 110% at your job, but it's still your job, and it's probably healthier to treat it as such than as, something you will commit to relentlessly without fail and give every element of yourself. Like, that can be a very destructive way to be. And so, again, the fact that he's the kind of guy who looks at it like, I will take the best job I can to support my family, and it was AEW, and oh, by the way, AEW is super nice and cool, and Sting's here, and it's great. Like, it all worked out super well. But he's just, it's that foundational, smart guy that he is, and not just jumping at shadows and making moves just to make them. So, makes me like him even more.
Right. I mean, I think that hits it on the head. Like AEW is a job. It's not a nostalgia act, and it's not a one shot, and it's not like a convention.
Yeah.
Where you go and you show up and everybody like.
And it's also not 5 days a week grinding for the sake of grinding,
Right, but ultimately though it's like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like. He's not there to be just like, and you can equate that to all the acts at AEW. Like, no one's there to be a nostalgia act that WWE relies on so hard. Sometimes It's like he's there because it's his job. It's just his job. This isn't like he's not a tourist here. Like he's a part of the show, and he's regaled as like a good commentator worthy of national wrestling exposure on national cable television.
There may be other people, I don't want to name names, but you can connect the dots. There may be other people doing commentary for AEW who are less employed because of their current talent at the job and more employed because of name value. But Tony is certainly not that person, and he is employed because he does a good job.
Right. Well, I guess 2022, in my head, the shoe is on the other foot, based on what I said earlier about Tony Schiavone in the 90s. Yeah.
I just saw Sting go through a table live in person a few weeks ago, so I can attest that even Sting is not just showing up to wave to the fans and sign autographs and sell action figures. Like, Sting is putting himself through fucking tables for no reason at this point. So everyone involved in that company is, when they show up to work, which is a much more reasonable amount of hours than WWE, they give their all then, and then they presumably pack their shit up and go home and relax for 4 or 5 days, which is a nice treat that they all deserve. So
yeah, well, I mean, it seems like AEW has carved a nice niche out there for everybody.
So, final thoughts here. Where do you sort of rank Tony in the pantheon of announcers? Like, let's say announcers from obviously in our lifetimes. Like, we're not gonna compare him to Gordon solely or whatever. But where do you put Tony at this point? Like, in your rankings, is he your favorite? Is he among the favorites? Like, what do you think?
Well, subjectively, he's going to be one of my favorites just because I listen to the podcast and I know him. I feel like I know him on a more personal level based on.
You've Zoomed with him, so you sort of do.
But also, I read his book too, so now I know everything. I think whether or not I think he's like the greatest announcer that's ever done wrestling or not, like I think it just the sentiment I'm trying to kind of convey here is like kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier. It's like what has this guy been for 20 years after WCW? Like, yeah, like whether he what doesn't matter where he was in that pantheon of like announcers. Like the guy had a place in wrestling and just to me was inexplicably not there. And it's like, well, there's got to be like you guys WWE even after they bought WCW and was during the ruthless aggression era, which we at some point we'll talk about season 2.
God.
You know, they still had like 3 or 4 different shows going on. Like you couldn't hire Tony Schiavone to anchor main event, like. You know, like when the network was around in 2000, whatever, 14, I guess, like you could have put him on the Cruiserweight Classic or something like that. Like there was no place for this guy in wrestling. Like, and to me, that's ridiculous because like, just like he says often, he was the voice of people's childhood. And it's not because he was an idiot. It's because he like had a style, a presentation to his delivery and to the entire wrestling brand and product and company. So like, I would like to believe that puts him high on a list of announcers, but it didn't for a long time, and that still befuddles me.
Yeah, it's a shame that the break probably I would say ultimately did him good because of how we regard him now and the time off and the fresh way he looks at the business. Like I think that's all nice. If he had been prodding away for 20 more years, I don't know if we'd feel the same, but it is a great what if, and he is one of the unfortunate victims of WCW going under and no real second company emerging for so long because there wasn't a spot for him, and I'm sure Vince looked at him as WCW guy, like don't want this guy on our TV. Though he brought in Joey Styles, he did all these other things that he brought in plenty of outsiders, but for some reason Tony was not anyone who made that cut. And I feel like there's a Southern bias there, there's a WCW bias there, and who would knows if Tony had come in and reinvented himself. But I don't think he fits in the Ruthless Aggression era. I don't think he fits in even that 20 years of wrestling. I think he fits in AEW. Like, I think it's just fortuitous circumstance that he's back now doing the job at a company that is pretty much like, not bare bones wrestling, but the most straightforward mainstream wrestling product we've seen in quite some time, and I think that just suits him. He's not a bells and whistles guy. I couldn't imagine calling some of the weird shit that WWE did and with a straight face. He called a lot of weird WCW shit, so it's not like he worked in the Russo WCW era, so he saw some stuff. But
if you squint, the Yeti and the Fiend, like what's really the difference here?
That's true. He could have pulled it off, but it's if you're able to take the financial and professional elements out of the equation, it's nice that he didn't have to be tied to any of that. Like I think it leaves him fresh and unique, for lack of a better term, for what AEW is doing right now. Like it's a breath of fresh air. It's like, oh, Tony's back and he's had 2 decades to recharge those batteries, and now he's doing his thing. Like I think that is going to elevate him to the top 2 or 3 spot. And in terms of wrestling announcers, like he's seen so much and he's seen so many eras, and he still seems vibrant and worthy of the job. Like you said, not a nostalgia act, certainly not trading on his old resume. Like it's all working out really nicely, and this book is the capper of all that. So if you like Tony Schiavone, if you listen to his podcast, if you like AEW and you want to know more of his story, see his various visages drawn for you in different forms, Butts and Seats is out right now. Butts and Seats, the Tony Schiavone story, and it's available, and you should get it because it's a solid little read. And Tony is a friend of the show, so obviously you should get it.
Solid little read and not a treat.
Fine, it's a treat.
Okay, good. I thought my ears were mistaken when.
You're right. I'm going to declare this a treat. So, Awesome Truth's official treat of February 2022 is Butts and Seats. So,
great. Well,
go check it out.
I agree.
And if you want to check out more of us with Tony Schiavone and Dirk Manning, the authors of this particular book, you can find that and more in our archives at awesometruth.libsyn.com. You can subscribe to us everywhere podcasts are delivered. Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, they're all there. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at awesometruthpod. Well, thanks for joining us. Great to talk, Tony. Great to read a comic that was better than Jim Cornette comic and Undertaker comic. So in that sense, an upgrade in the graphic novel world is certainly appreciated.
Yeah, and you know, this is the perfect length to consume Tony's story, and I love a good comic book. So all pluses.
All pluses. That's right. A treat for the fans. So go give it a shot. Thank you all so much for listening, and remember, the truth will set you free.